We all want the good life, and many times there is one thing that we think we must have if we're going to be happy. Evidently, that's what Eve thought. At the beginning of the Bible, we're given this description of this incredibly beautiful garden in Eden. And we're told in chapter 2 of Genesis that the Lord God planted this garden in Eden, and he made to spring up every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. The tree of life was in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The tree of life stood there in the garden as a promise to Adam and Eve that if they obeyed him regarding the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they would eat of the tree of life, and as good as life was in Eden, it would get even better. It would go from good to glorious. But of course, when Satan came along in the form of a serpent and pointed Eve's attention at that forbidden tree, she became deceived, and she began to think that it was the fruit of that tree she needed to make her happy. You see, she wanted the good life. She wasn't willing to trust and wait for God to provide the good life to her in his timing and in his way. She wasn't willing to obey his word, and so she reached out for what she thought was going to make her happy, what she thought was going to make her wise, what she thought was going to taste so good. And I think that first bite had to turn so sour in her stomach so very quickly. Well, this isn't just the story of Eve, is it? It's our story too. There's so many things that God has forbidden, and yet we think to ourselves, that is what I must have to be happy. And we reach out and we take it. And instead of becoming wise, we become fools. And instead of being satisfied, nothing we find will satisfy us. Well, the tree of life appears again in the Bible. At the very end of the Bible, we read in Revelation 22 about this tree of life. Because you see, the tree of life isn't just a thing in our past that Adam and Eve had to leave in the Garden of Eden and could never eat from again. You see, a second Adam has come along. And because he passed through the flaming arrows of judgment himself at the cross, he has opened up the way back into a garden that's actually going to be even better than Eden. And in Revelation 22, we read that in the middle of this garden, that on either side of the river, the tree of life, it says, with its 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit each month, the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. The tree of life isn't just something in our past, it's a promise in our future. What is this tree of life? Well, I think John, who wrote Revelation, I think he told us earlier in his gospel, in fact, the very first chapter of his gospel, when he said about Jesus, in him was life. You see, Revelation 22 is telling us that planted right there in the midst of this greater garden to come is the tree of life, Christ himself. And the way into the good life, my friends, is to eat of this tree, is to abide in this vine, is to take hold of Christ, recognizing that the good life is trusting what God has provided to us in the person and work of Christ. Won't you even today, don't wait for the greater garden to come to begin feeding on the tree of life, the person of Christ, as you open up his word and as you abide in him and as you welcome his spirit to work in you. That's how we begin to enter into the good life.